Thank you for your gift. Oh, I would like to. I've been thinking about you all day. I see you here today.
I can just do this right here. Hello, everyone. I want to welcome everyone today to today's special brown bag presentation. My name is Stephen McLeod, and I'm the Director of Library Programs here at the Washington Presidential Library. And before we get started, I wanted to remind you of a few events that we've got coming up. We're actually going to be hosting another brown bag tomorrow, October 25th, with our research fellow Matthew Harrow, who's back here. Matthew, you can raise your hand. And Matthew was going to be speaking on his research topic, Rochambeau and the American War of Independence. We're also going to be hosting a brown bag on October 31, and that's going to be with our Associate Curator, Amanda Isaac, and historic costumer, Catherine Bright Brown. And they're going to present on the study and reproduction of 18th century garments. And of course, on November 1 and 2, we're going to be hosting our annual George Washington Symposium, which is going to showcase the fellowship of our showcase the work of our fellowship program over the last decade. And that event is entitled Founding Fellows: 10 Years of Academic Excellence. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker. Sherri Burr is the Dickinson Chair and Regents Professor of Law Emerita at the University of New Mexico School of Law. She earned her BA from Mount Holyoke College, her MPA from Princeton University, and her JD from the Yale Law School. Her 27th book, Complicated Lives, Free Blacks in Virginia 1619 to 1865, was published in 2019 and was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in History. Sherri worked on that particular book while a fellow at the International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. Sherri is the first recipient of the Washington Library's Black Women United for Action Fellowship. And we're very pleased to have a number of representatives from Black Women United for Action in the audience today. She joins us today to discuss her research topic, generational impact, an economic comparison of Mount Vernon's enslaved population who received freedom in 1800 with those who remained enslaved until 1863. So please join me in a warm Mount Vernon welcome for Dr. Sherri Burr.
Thank you, Stephen, for that warm welcome. I want to begin by thanking Mrs. Sheila Coates, who is the head of Black Women United for Action. And I would like to gift her it's my 27th book, but it's my first history book. The others are law books, so they don't quite count in this setting. And I want to gift her this book and thank her for all the work that Black Women United did to create this fellowship. They had a gala, they raised money, the fellowship is endowed. So even though I am the first recipient, I will not be the last. So I want to thank Mrs. Coates. So in addition to Black Women United for Action and Mrs. Coates, I want to thank the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, Mary Thompson, who wrote The Unavoidable Subject of Regret, And she was on my list to be the first person I met when I got here. And we spent 3 hours over lunch in which she explained she worked on her book for 40 years. And I asked her what sustained that research, that commitment, and she had 2 words: he changed, in reference to Washington. And I just thought she's really amazing, and I want to thank her. I want to thank the Washington Library, and there's so many people to thank, including Lindsay, Stephen, Samantha, Ileana, Jocelyn, Chumaya, Amanda, Caroline, and so many others. I even see Susan in the back, who I met at the Reef Lane ceremony for that Black Women United host annually. So I want to thank Susan as well. The wonderful staff of Woodlawn Tudor Place in Arlington have received me and spoke into me about what's going on in their places. And several people from Woodlawn are here, including Heather the head and Elizabeth Reese. And they've done an amazing job of starting to tell the stories of the enslaved at Woodlawn. And if you haven't had a chance to see their current exhibition, I highly recommend it. Additionally, Tudor Place has a wonderful new exhibition where they are telling the story of the enslaved. And when I walked in, I was startled to see that they even have pictures of the descendants of the enslaved on the walls. It's rare in a space like that something like that would happen. And it's a sign of how life is evolving with regard to bringing to surface the stories of the enslaved. So I want to thank Woodlawn, Tudor Place, and Arlington House was the place I went to last week, and they were also very helpful in sharing with me their stories and how they are reimagining their space to include stories of the enslaved. So my operating question is, how harmful was slavery? And I started to think about this after Florida published that it was going to start teaching its students that some Black people benefited from slavery because it taught them useful skills. And everybody, there's usually a little chuckle at just the thought of that, but that's what they're teaching people. And what I thought is, when I started thinking about Mount Vernon, because George Washington owned a sizable number of humans, 123 at his death, Martha Washington's dower slaves, which she only had a life estate of 1/3, and then she had trust over the rest of them for her minor children and then grandchildren. And then it also had enslaved people hired from plantations. And it occurred to me that this was one of the only places, and maybe the only place in the world, where I could test this question of how harmful was slavery. And I could do it by doing a research study looking at what happened to the enslaved that George freed and through his will, and then what happened to those who remained enslaved not only till 1863, but some did not receive their freedom till after the Civil War. So I'm at the beginning of my project. I'm open to questions, comments, advice, and I hope by the end, as I tell you what I plan to do, if you have anything, any advice, any questions, I would very much appreciate that. So here's my basic books project, and it's coming in basically the kind of way that one creates this kind of material. I liken doing history research to creating a puzzle, but unlike puzzles that you get from the store where you have all the frame pieces, so you always start with the frame, and you have a photo of what you're supposed to be creating. With history, you get the pieces, and then you yourself have to create your frame and create what the ultimate project looks like. And so within a couple of days of being here, talking to Mary Thompson, talking to Mia and Jocelyn and a few others, it occurred to me that my project should be framed in 4 parts. So the first part honors what Mary said about George Washington. He changed, and then I would add, and then he changed lives. So I'm going to talk to you about the ways he changed. And what's significant is that because of that change, that enabled him to be the only president, the only signer of the Constitution to arrange to free his entire population of enslaved people through his will. No other president or signer of the Constitution did this. As many of you know, with regard to Jefferson, he was so impoverished that most of the enslaved, with the exception of few Hemmings, were sold right after he died. And so that did not happen with the population that belonged to George Washington. They were given freedom. So the second part I'm calling the 123, and these are George's enslaved population. And my theme is towards freedom with excitement and anxiety. And I think the excitement comes from knowing that finally you're going to be free. You're going to be able to choose where you live, what you wear, what food you eat. And it's by the benefits of your own labor. You get to determine who to sell your labor to, and you get the benefit of all that brings in. And yet, in this instance, there's going to be a lot of anxiety because some of George's enslaved people were married to dower slaves. So, and I will talk about what happened in terms of the splits. So the anxiety is going to come from losing access on a daily basis or at least a weekly basis to their family members. Part 3, I'm calling the 156, which is in the census that was drawn up, and I'm calling my operating theme is toward continued enslavement with fear and dread. And I use the word fear and dread because within the enslaved community, the times that were most fearful was when a master died or a master had financial straits, because that was the time when people were most likely to be sold away and separated from their families. And this is also the time when a lot of people would self-liberate because they were afraid that they were going to be sold to a space where they would never see anybody within their families again. And then part 4, I'm 1870, and here's my goal. My goal is to be able to track as many of the enslaved population who was here at Mount Vernon at the time that George died and their descendants to the 1870 census. Because by the 1870 census, the entire population of the enslaved at Mount Vernon are free. They were either freed by George through his will, followed up by a deed by Martha. They're freed in 1863 through the Custis Estate in Arlington, and I'll talk about that a little more, or they're freed after the Civil War. So by the 1870 census, everybody is free. And I'm going to tell you about the metrics that I want to test what happened with the various populations at that time. So many of you probably heard this. Mark Robinson, the Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina, said, "Slavery's not bad. Some people need to be slaves. I wish they would bring back slavery, and I would certainly buy a few." And I thought if I had a superpower where I could transmit people back to a time and space, I would transplant him back to a time where he could be enslaved in place of his ancestors just for a month or a week, and have him say, would he want to bring back slavery after that experience? I would also think that if he could have a conversation with this guy, he would never think that slavery is something he'd want to bring back. And I said as a slaveholder, we know Washington eventually changed, but he changed from a space that many people would never change. And that is, he was born into a family that owned slaves. He became a slave owner himself at the age of 11 when his father, Augustine, died and willed him a 283-acre estate and 10 slaves. As a young adult, he continued to purchase slaves. And then after he inherits Mount Vernon, we know that he engaged in many of the harshest things that we connect with the institution of slavery, including punishing his slaves, whipping, giving them taxing work assignments, selling them to the West Indies if they ran away, so that they would never see their families again. And that's a question even Mary Thompson addresses in her books right away. She says that when people take the slavery tour at Mount Vernon, that's one of their first questions, is they want to know if George Washington was a nice enslaver. They want to know that because they want to be able to separate him in some way from this institution. And so she says right away, everything that you associate with the worst of slavery happened here. So what's interesting to me is, in my opinion, the change started in Washington's thinking about the enslaved population, about people of African descent during the Revolutionary War. And there are several quotes from him, including, it has been represented to me that the free Negroes who have served in this army are very much dissatisfied at being discarded, as it has to be apprehended that they may employ in the ministerial army. I have presumed to depart from the revolution, respecting them, and have give license for their being enlisted. If this is approved by Congress, I will put a stop to it. So what's happening during the revolution is this is the first encounter on a substantial basis that Washington has with people of African descent who are not enslaved by him, who he does not own. Various states, so he rides north to take control of the Continental Army. Rhode Island and various states have sent full troops of freed Africans. So, and then over the course of the Revolutionary War, he observes their bravery, the fact that they re-enlist at a rate higher than the whites who have re-enlisted. Many of the whites were deserting when the black soldiers would re-enlist. And at that point, nobody's getting paid. So they are re-enlisting because of their commitment to the cause. So this starts him thinking, and I think at another point, it's like, as he's interacting with them, by 1778, he says, I wish to get quit of Negroes, because he's, in my mind, people of African descent have gone from being othered so that you can enslave them to human, which you would never do. And I think that's part of the change. And that's because of his interaction with these people of African descent. This is one of the most famous portraits depicting a blue coat, black soldier taking on the red coat soldiers. And as many of you know, the first person to die from a red coat bullet was Crispus Attucks, who was a mulatto person up in Massachusetts. The other thing that happened during the Revolutionary War was Washington's correspondence with Phillis Wheatley, an enslaved poet. And there's a book by her, or about her, The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley, just won the Washington Prize. And that's on sale at the bookstore. And I know we have the book buyer here. There you are. And so, and she's an amazing poet, and she's an example of change, because in her early poetry, she talks about herself as being, saved from Africa, saved from a savage land. But as she evolves, she realizes, I've been taken from my family that I will never see again. My family is probably very concerned that they will never see me again. So she's an example of an evolution in her thinking as well. So she wrote this wonderful poem to Washington, and he actually invited her to come see him. And as far as historians have found, she's the only enslaved person that he ever invited to come see at camp in this context. So I think that's part of the change as well. So post-Revolutionary War, he says, I mean never mean to possess another slave by purchase. And there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for this abolition of slavery, but there is only one proper and effectual mode by which it can be accomplished, and that is by legislative authority. He also says he wants the plan adopted. He's starting to realize how inefficient a labor system slavery is. There are comments in some of his letters where he's starting to realize, if I hire 100 people, I have 100 people who work a good day's work and they produce. If I enslave 100 people, I might have 50, 56 who are working at any given time, because people get sick, women have children, so they're not working at that time. There are people on the estate who are called past labor. When he starts inheriting slaves as an 11-year-old, all of these people are pretty much working. And so the older he gets, the more he realizes the responsibility that he has for all the people who are enslaved by them. Because there's a law in Virginia that says you can't free a person who can no longer work and take care of themselves. Because we do not want these people to become a burden on the Commonwealth. So enslavers did not have the option to work someone to death and then free them at the end of their lives when they could no longer work. Nor could they kill everyone because to rid themselves of this responsibility, because that was one of the few instances where an enslaver would be punished, probably hung, for killing their enslaved population. So they were responsible from these people from birth to death. And towards the end of his life, when Washington has a lot of people who've been around him for a long time, he realizes he's still responsible. He still has to feed these people. He still has to clothe them. He still has to house them. And in the census that's produced in the summer of 1799, before he died, there are a lot of people who are designated as past labor. So they are no longer able to work, but he is still responsible for them. And so he talks about how, half the workers I keep on this state would render me greater net profit than I now derive from the whole. So he's realizing what an inefficient system it is. There's this reference to this species of property. And he said, were he not principled against selling Negroes as you would do on a cattle market, I would not in 12 months from this day be possessed of one as a slave, he says in 1794. So he would like to quit himself of Negroes. He would love to have a situation where there were none on the estate. And in fact, he starts thinking about schemes. One is he had purchased all this land in Ohio, and he thought, well, if I sell half of it, maybe I can use that money to purchase the dower slaves because he has no agency over them, purchase them, and then I can resettle the entire population, my slaves and the dower slaves, on the rest of the land in Ohio. So that's one of the schemes that he comes up with. The problem is nobody wants to buy his land in Ohio, so then that creates a problem, so that he can't implement that idea of ridding himself of slavery. So towards the end of his life, he writes a will. It's July 9, 1799. And he says, upon the decease of my wife, it is my will and desire that all of the slaves which I hold in my own right shall receive their freedom. Now, why is he saying at the decease of my wife? He's saying it because he knows there's going to be incredible emotional pain when she dies and his enslaved population are going to be separated from their families. So by putting that off, the freedom of his enslaved population, till she dies, he is delaying the point in which these families are being wrenched apart. She, however, frees them earlier, and Abigail Adams, we know her thinking, writes a letter to her sister where she says that Martha Washington did not feel as though her life were safe in their hands, many of whom would be told that it was in their interest to get rid of her. She was therefore advised that it would be in her interest to set them free at the close of the year. So she's afraid. The word is out that they're all going to get freedom when she dies. So why not, take matters into your own hands and get freedom a little early. So she and her husband have a disconnect on this matter. So she sets them free early. She signs the deed of manumission in December 1800. That becomes effective on January 1st, 1801. Washington's will also freed William Lee immediately and left him a pension of $30 a year, which is the equivalent of about $75,000 in 2024. And as many of you know, William Lee was his valet, valet, who served with him during the Revolutionary War. And because Washington was target number one for the British, because it's well known in any military campaign that if you can cut off the head, you can pretty much bring an end to the motivation for the opposition. So he was number one target. And because William Lee was next to him at all times, William Lee was a target as well. And he was his faithful valet. Unfortunately, William Lee suffered a couple of instances where he fell off horses and was no longer able to work. And on the slavery tour, they tell people that, and they show the area where he became a cobbler. So he was put to work making shoes. And some people might think, well, why not just let him be past labor? But I think Washington understands that that people need to work. They need something to do. It's just part of human psyche to need a purpose. So he's put to work making shoes. And then he's freed. Now, on December 14, 1799, when Washington dies, he sets free the 123. The Dower slaves are divided among Martha Washington's grandchildren, and the 41 who've been hired from other plantations are returned. There's in some of the conversation with one of the people who's hired, he's hired because his owner owes a debt to Washington, and Washington doesn't want to take any more Negroes in his plantation, but he agrees to do this. And then the guy leaves because he wants to go see his family. And Washington is talking to the other enslaver and saying, I think you should keep him. And the other enslaver is saying, no, I've already told him if he doesn't go work for you, he's going to be sold south. So then the person decides to settle down, work for Washington, because at least Washington's Mount Vernon is close enough that he will occasionally see his family. Now, this isn't just the beginning of an Excel spreadsheet that I've created to do the tracking. So, and what I want to draw your attention to is one of the things I'm doing is looking at their family and looking at whether they had intermarried with a dower slave. And this is because we know that if they married a Washington slave, then the person they married is going to be free. And if they married a dower slave, that person's going to remain enslaved. And we have this instance of Ben, whose first wife, Joan, died in 1786, leaving him with 3 children. He then marries Peg, a 30-year-old dower slave, and they have 3 children. The second excerpt is my plan to track the census ages, where they are during the various censuses will be the other part of this spreadsheet. Okay, so look at Ben. So Ben marries Joan. They have 3 children, and their children, Agnes and Betty, have additional children. So because Ben and his the wife of children of Joan are freed on January 1st, 1801 by Martha, that whole line of his family is freed. However, he's married to Peg. He has married Peg after Joan dies, and Peg's whole line of children, Peg and her 3 children remain enslaved, and they are given to Wash Custis. So that's an example of an absolute split, the kind of thing that Washington was worried about and why he had delayed, because he knew this kind of pain was coming. Now, the free Black population, I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. So in 1790, all of Washington's slaves are still enslaved. They're still enslaved in 1800. And then the 123 are freed in 1810. So they are, between 1800 and 1810, we go from 20,000 free Blacks to 30,000. So Washington's freed people are going to first be picked up by the 1810 census. The other thing I like to draw people's attention to is that notice that there are more free Blacks in the South than there are in the North. And the reality was, when you track this data forward to the conclusion of the Civil War, there were always more free Blacks in the South than there were in the North. Never did the amount of free Blacks in the North exceed those in the South. And also, percentage-wise, the North had more free Blacks percentage-wise who were free, but in absolute numbers, they had fewer than in the South. And the reason for that, I surmise, is because when people are freed in the South, they tended to stay pretty much nearby. 1, because they had family members. 2, because 1790, 1800 is not like Google, where you can just go type it up and see what another place would look like. And you didn't know what you would be going to if you left. And Virginia had passed a law, several laws, that if you left or your children, or you sent your children out, they could not return. So there was a risk that if you left, you could not get back in the state. So people tended to stay in Virginia, in the South, where they were freed because of that. How do we get to the point where Martha's people remain enslaved? Peg, who's married to Will, remains enslaved. And I like to go back to this act of 1862 that the Virginia House of Burgess passed, where they said, children got by an Englishman upon a Negro woman shall be bond or free according to the condition of the mother, and if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he shall pay double the fines of a former act. So basically, this is setting up a system where enslavement is determined by the status of the woman. And it's also acknowledging that there are free Black women, and there are several laws related to free Negro women that are passed in the colony and have been so since 1619. But what it does mean is that that enslavers who impregnate their enslaved female humans get to keep the children as slaves. So they're not considered their children where they would automatically get their freedom. Of course, if they impregnate someone who's free, then that person remains free. And that's why you end up with the separation with Ben's family, because Joan was going to be free, then all her children are free, whereas Peg is still enslaved, all her children are enslaved. The other act that set up 1670, that set up this concept of perpetual enslavement was, and this is, you know, when you look at this seems absolutely crazy, right? At no point in any of the laws that the House of Burgess passed since 1619, at no point did they ever say that all Black people are going to be slaves. They never said that. This is the closest they got. They said, whereas some dispute has arisen whether Indians taken in war by any other nation and by the nation, and that taketh them sold to the English are servants for life or terms of years, it is enacted that all servants not being Christian imported by shipping shall be slaves for their lives, but what shall come by land shall serve, if boys or girls, until 30 years of age, if men or women, 12 years and no longer. Okay, notes the difference. If you become or captured, or you came here by land, i.e. Native Americans, the indigenous population, then we will only keep you as a servant for a term of years. If, however, you came by shipping, and we know that Africans came by shipping, then you can be enslaved for life. So it's the combination of these two laws that set the stage for permanent legal enslavement, where you end up with the dower slave situation, where Martha slaves and the people born to them remain enslaved. Okay, so, and I don't expect you to be able to read this, but what this is another spreadsheet where I am tracking the division of the dower slaves by Martha's grandchildren. So there was a proposed division, lot 1 for Mrs. Law, Eliza Law. There was, and a total value assigned of 1854 pounds. Lot 2 for Mr. Lewis, who is married to Nellie. Lot 3 for Mr. Peters, and then lot 4 for Mr. Wash Custis. So the reason why Eliza Law gets to the enslaved population in her name is because George had insisted that she sign a prenuptial agreement. So if you don't sign before she married Mr. Law, if you don't sign a prenup and you are a female at this time, your husband becomes responsible for all your property. So he gets complete control over your property. And this set the stage for a lot of interesting outcomes in Virginia relationships. There was a man whose white wife produced 3 half-Black children. And he didn't file for the divorce until after the third. And the first came 6 months after they married. And I think part of the reason why he didn't divorce her, even though it's obvious these children are not his, is because of her resources. If he divorces her, he loses control over her resources. So it's an interesting situation where women are losing control, men are marrying them, where they get control. But on the other hand, a woman like her can do whatever she wants, because to a certain extent, before he will finally say, I've had enough. And probably he had enough because the whole community is talking about the fact that those children are obviously not his. So Eliza Law gets to keep the lot in her name. Nellie, it's her husband who is assigned these, and the same for Martha. And then George Washington Custis gets, of course, to keep his slaves. Why the values are different, I don't know. They started assigning these values like Anna, 65 and 30. There's no age for the first Anna, but there's an age for the second Anna. So I have no idea where they came up with these values. Why the values are uneven, because it seemed like if they were dividing, that you would normally try to get the values pretty much even, but that's not what happened on this spreadsheet, or the list that they created, and then I created the spreadsheet. Okay, now One of the post January 1st divisions, 1801 divisions, was Isaac and Kitty. Kitty was a dower slave. Isaac had 9 children by Kitty. Isaac is freed by GW, but Kitty and the 3 children are divided by the 4 Custis grandchildren. So this is one, for me, this is one of the most painful to imagine. Is not only is there a separation between Isaac and his family, there's a separation among all the children are divided, and they go to different Nellie's, Martha Peters, Wash Custis, Eliza Law. They go to different people. Another example, and these are slaves that went to Tudor Place, both Sally Twine and her husband George. They had several children. One of the things that happened, and this is another example of the disadvantage of being continued enslaved. Not only are you subject to being sold, and in fact, Tudor Place has shared with me a record where a lot of enslaved people were sold almost immediately. Some of them, they never even took possession. They were sold right out of Mount Vernon and sent to other locations. But in this instance, there's a granddaughter named Barbara. She is impregnated by a Tudor Place great grandson of Martha's. They have twins, and one of the twins is Hannah, and she marries a man named Alfred Pope, and they have all these children. And what this means is, in several instances, because of the males in Martha's family impregnating enslaved women, it's pretty clear that she has a shadow family of color, and she has 5th, 6th, and 7th great grandchildren of color who are alive today. How do we get there? It starts really early with an alleged half sister of hers, Anne Dandridge, where her father impregnated an enslaved woman. Jack Custis is the half brother of her husband, Daniel Park, but he dies. So he's going to be her brother-in-law, but he dies before the age of 18. William Costin, and this is his picture here. He is the son of Jackie, her son, who impregnated an enslaved woman. And William Costin was ultimately freed by, convinced Eliza to free William Costin. And he's essentially the half brother of the 4 Custis children who have survived to adulthood. We have Hannah Cole Pope, who is the daughter of Barbara Cole Williams, who I just mentioned. And she's impregnated by a Peter great-grandson. And Tudor Place shared that they have done DNA studies between the white Peters and the black Peters to confirm the DNA connections. We have Mariah Carter, whose mother, Ariana Carter, was impregnated by George Washington Parke Custis, Martha's grandson. So she becomes a great-granddaughter of Mariah, and she marries a Syphax, and there are hundreds of descendants of the Syphax line who are Martha's 5th, 6th, 7th great-grandchildren. And we have Lucy Brannan, whose mother, Caroline Brannan, was impregnated by Parke Custis, George Washington Parke Custis. So this is another example of how Martha ends up with great-grandchildren of color alive today because of the impregnation that happened. And we always consider this, we think of this as one of the worst abuses of slavery, that where the enslaver would impregnate an enslaved woman who had no right to refuse because she's property. So Tudor Place shared this wonderful picture. These are pictures of granddaughters of Hannah Pope, and they were brought to Tudor Place to be inspected by Britannia Peter Kinnan, Martha Washington's great granddaughters. So these girls are essentially Martha's fourth great grandchildren. And they have grandchildren who are alive today. They're absolutely beautiful, gorgeous. And Tudor Place tells the story of Britannia receiving them in the parlor, asking them to come forward, inspecting them. And it's pretty clear that she's trying to discern to what extent they look like one of her brothers who might have impregnated their grandmother. So I just love that picture. Now, in tracking everyone to the 1870 census, there are many things that come up. We know we'll get name, age, sex, color, and birthplace. But interesting, you'll get the profession, occupation, and trade, the value of real estate, if any, the value of personal estate that's owned, whether they are disabled, whether they're able to speak English, whether the person attended school within the previous year, whether they have a foreign birth of father or mother, and whether they're able to read or write. And so what's highlighted in bold struck me as matrices that could be used to compare in the 1870 census after tracking Georgia's freed slaves and their descendants to the 1870 census with what I can find of Martha's freed slaves. Because so what I will do is, my plan is to get matrix numbers to figure out like the parameters of what happened to Georgia's freed slaves during this time. And then multiply that by a certain factor because there were more Dower slaves than there were Georgia's free slaves. And if Florida is right, then then the Martha Dower slaves will be more literate, have more property, have a higher personal estate value. If they're right, if they're saying that slavery benefited the enslaved, we'll have numbers to show. If they're right, then the numbers will show that that Martha's people were better off. So let's just see a show of hands. How many of you think we get to the 1870 census and Martha's people will be better off than Georgia's people? Judge, you think Martha's people will be better off?
Maybe not as many by number, but maybe by achievement have moved higher than some from my 1800 group.
Okay. That's true. Right. Okay. Right. And that's a good point. Okay, a footnote. Okay, so that's a good point because during some of the Dower slaves were freed, like Wash Custis arranged for the freedom of the children that he had impregnated. So some of them were freed ahead of time. How many of you think that we get to the 1870 census and we compare Georgia's slaves matrix to Martha's slave matrix, that Georgia's slave matrix will exceed those of Martha's, that they will have purchased more property, have a higher value in property, and be more literate? Can I see a show of hands? Okay. All right. So that's, and how many of you are reserving judgment? Okay. All right. So that's interesting. So only one person thinks that Martha's enslaved population will be better off. The majority think that Georgia's freed slave people will be better off. And then there are a few people who are abstaining, waiting for the data. Okay, there are people who wait for the data, and I totally understand that. Okay, so let me just talk to you about the challenges of trying to get to the 1870 census, trying to track these people to the 1870 census. First challenge is the Dower slaves were divided among her 4 grandchildren, and different things happen. In the Peter household, for example, they're selling people right away out of, or they're gifting them, and many were sold or sent south to Louisiana and Mississippi. Some ended up in Texas. We have account ledgers to a certain extent of showing people being sold, but we don't always know where they were sold to. And it's a reminder of how slavery was the original identity theft. You know, when these people were stealing people from African villages and so forth, they were not keeping records of the names and where they were getting these people from. And so that's something that goes missing in these account ledgers of where the people went. We do have church records. So, for example, at Tudor Place, many of the enslaved were also communicants of the colored people at Christ Church, Georgetown. And some of these churches keep really wonderful church records. So we might be able to track using those records. Woodlawn, Heather, and Elizabeth have shared the 2 studies that they've done where they have tried to track what happened to the enslaved population. They hired a wonderful researcher in Louisiana, Yael, who was able to track many of them to the Butler plantation, where the daughter at Woodlawn, the daughter at Woodlawn had married into this Butler family of enslavers in Louisiana. And there's actually a book out about the Butlers. So that means that because these people are remaining enslaved until right up to the Civil War, then we're going to be able to get records from the Freedom Bureau related to those people. Tudor Place has documented that between the wife and the husband, they only freed one person. And that's because they allowed him, Ralph Anderson, and perhaps his father, Sam Anderson, a freed George Washington enslaved person, to purchase his freedom. So that was their element of freedom, freeing people. They would let one person buy his freedom. That's what happened in Tudor Place. The challenges with regard to GW's freed slaves is, one, we get is that no first name, no last names. You know, there's a list, no last names. So one of the things that I've been doing since I've been here is looking at free Black registries. And I've also ordered to go to New Mexico, where I work, several of these registries. And what I'm hoping is there's always usually a designation in the free Black registries as to how freed. And so I found already several who said they were freed by General George Washington in his will, or they were freed by a deed signed by his wife. So by tracking, those references to people freed by George or Martha, that will enable me to connect the first name and the ages to people on the list who I only have first names to. And then that will let me start tracking census records, land purchases, and so forth. And many of them most likely stayed in Virginia and DC for the reasons I stated earlier. There are also city directories, newspaper articles, church records, land purchases, archives, where I will be able to find many of Georgia's people to be able to track them through the 1870 census. So in looking at this, I would say the most difficult challenge is going to be the Dower enslaved people because of that split among the 4. So we shall see. And then there are county clerks. And then just by conclusion, it troubles me that people say things in jest, like they want to bring back slavery, that Mark Robinson. And there are, by some estimates, approximately 50 million people who are enslaved around the globe now in 2024. And one of the things that I hope will happen as you tell more of the stories of the enslaved population at Mount Vernon, what happened to them, potentially the economic disadvantage of being enslaved 60 years longer, 3 generations longer, that people will never again say in just let's bring back slavery. And I think by telling George Washington's evolution and his thinking, and also, that it's both a morally and economically bankrupt institution, that people will see just how problematic the institution is. And I conclude by saying that slavery is buried in the past of American history. Let's keep it there, even run a stake through its heart so that it never returns. And with that, I want to thank you for listening to my presentation, and I'm open for questions. Thank you. Okay. All right. Okay, Judge, you have a question? Well, wait, you have to say it into the mic so it can be streamed. The people who are streaming can hear you.
Good afternoon. Mine is not so much a question, but a statement. When you said about slavery and asking whether it was good, I just want to make a reference to my cousin
I
Gladys.
said Florida said it was
Yeah,
beneficial.
that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Florida, yeah. Gladys
It's not
Quanda-
Sherri Burr
yeah,
saying
yeah.
it's good. It's
Gladys
Florida. Okay.
Quanda Tensil, my cousin, who was the first and for many years the only African American interpreter guide here. I remember her telling us at a meeting or something that one question she got all the time was, George Washington a good slaveholder? She said, I would look at them. I have what we call a pregnant pause. Sir, good and slavery do not belong in the same sentence. He was better than some and worse than others, but good does not belong in the same sentence as the word slavery. I just want to throw that out.
Yes. Thank you. And that's how Mary Thompson begins her book. So thank you. Other questions? There's a question back there.
First, thank you for this talk and the research that you are embarking on. I think it's very valuable. I'm going to agree with you that I think this is one of the only places where you could do this kind of research and perform a case study between the two populations. This is a massive amount of data that you're looking at, and power to you. This is awesome. Is there a way that you're going to incorporate anecdotal information, into this work? And then also, Judge Quander kind of touched on this a little bit. Is there a way to account for perhaps the successes that some of these people might have had because of their connection to Mount Vernon and to George Washington? Like, we know that the community of Gum Springs, as a free Black community before the Civil War, were left be sometimes because of their connection to George Washington. There was maybe a little protection that was provided there. Is there a way that you're accounting for that?
Yes,
I know that's a lot of questions at once.
No, that's fine. And I definitely think there's a way to account for that when I'm doing the discussion of what happened to George Washington's freed enslaved population. What was the first part you said?
Oh, just anecdotal information?
Yes.
How you're-
Okay. So I'm thinking that's going to be my last chapter or two. I've already started interviewing people who have tracked their families to Mount Vernon enslaved population. And the League of Descendants of the Enslaved at Mount Vernon has just turned over 14 oral histories that they did. I got them on Tuesday, but it wasn't enough time for me to incorporate that information into this presentation. So, and Judge Quander is one of the people who did an oral history. So my plan is to review those oral histories. I've reserved a week of my time here to come back. And once I've reviewed those histories, to be able to do follow-up interviews with those people to get additional information. So yes, I am planning to do more modern stories, especially because in the African community, oral history is ancient. It goes back, in Ghana, they had the griots, the oral historians for the family, who would track thousands of years of history for the tribe. So definitely, I am planning to include modern day tales of what they learned from their families.
Well, again, thank you for the presentation.
Closer.
Oh, is that better?
Yeah, much
Okay.
closer.
Okay. Are you planning on sort of accounting for any legal or financial restrictions that may have been placed upon the slaves that George Washington that were freed that perhaps would have limited their ability for financial success?
Yes. So when I was working on my first book, one of the things that struck me is that Virginia never took away the right of of people of African descent to own property. Never did they take that away, and that was how I was able to track my family. I'm an ancestral Virginian, and my fourth great grandfather and his parents were freed in 1787. My fourth great grandfather was 2, and his parents were in their 20s by an enslaver named Benjamin Crawley. And I was able to track all his land purchases. And that was one thing that never got restricted. So I will be able to track the land purchases once I identify the names, full names. I will be able to track the land purchases. Now, there are, of course, just restrictions by the nature of being a free Black within an enslaved society. One, that they have to carry that pass at all times. And for those of you familiar with Solomon Northup's story, you know that he got separated from his past, and that's how he got sold down south to Louisiana. And it took working with someone coming from Canada to get access to a duplicate of that pass to show that he's free. So yes, I do plan to account for the restrictions that they have, but one of the nice things about land purchases is that that was not restricted as long as somebody was willing to sell you property.
Thank you, Sherri. I had one thought, which is you talked about modern oral histories, but in the 1930s, the Works Progress Administration did a series of interviews with the descendants of enslaved people, and that would give you something 90 years ago to look at that might have memories that are also very useful for when you're trying to set your end date.
Right.
And the other thing that occurred to me is that there's actually perhaps a penalty of staying in Virginia, because after Nat Turner, Virginia outlawed teaching Black people how to read. And so this is one of those places where the climate that they're in may actually lead some indicators to point in a way you don't predict, right? Because freed people will have access to Freedmen's Bureau schools. They'll have gone to school more recently. They might have the literacy that people in Virginia were denied under those laws.
Yeah, those are all very good points. So it is possible that when I get to the 1870 census and I look at the literacy matrix, that George Washington's population may not be significantly more literate than the Dower slave population. So we'll just see what happens when I get the data. With regard to the 1930 interviews, I did think about those. But I also thought by 1930, it's 129 years since George Washington's population will have been freed. So it's possible that there might be some interviews from people who are descendants of George Washington's population. So I do plan to check those. But yeah, so that's an excellent suggestion. Are there any other questions? Thoughts? Wait. Ileana's going to bring you the mic. There's the mic.
I have a thought about marriage. The laws govern marriage, and you spoke of the dowry enslaved who intermarried with Martha's bloodline, and then you say that they were the children that was the product of the marriage, they could be back into slavery. So is marriage being interpreted differently for the dowry enslaved breed?
Yeah,
It's-
let me just clarify a couple of things. One is within enslaved population marriages, they had to be approved by the enslaver, and they were not respected legally. So one of the things that happens when you look at the Freedmen's Bureau records is they are confirming marriages. Like people come in and say, we've been married, and they are confirming marriages so people have a record going forward, the fact that they were married. And also with regard to Martha's line of grandsons, great grandsons who are impregnating enslaved people, those were not marriages. They impregnated those women, they had children, the children might have married someone else, but those were not marriages. And indeed, it was illegal for Black people and white people to marry in antebellum Virginia. Yes, Judge Quander?
Thank you. I'm fascinated by everything you're doing, and I'm looking forward to the results and the conclusions, and I assume there are going to be some recommendations of some sort. So all of that done and behind us, what is going to happen, do you think, with the data that is going to be the result? You're going to have a lot of statistics, and I presume with some interviews, you're going to have some narration, and this may give rise to a book or books.
A book.
Okay, a book.
Yes.
So how are we going to hopefully have a positive impact upon the larger population of this nation as a result of looking at what happened to George Washington's enslaved?
I have the sense of that Miss Sheila Coates wants to answer your question.
Thank you. I certainly commend.
Close, the mic close.
Okay, I certainly commend, and this wonderful opportunity to hear your speak, what the research you've gone so far, and to the answer to a colleague here is that we envision the future by creating this African-American George Washington's presidential for the study of the library for the study of African-American history from 18th century to present. So we're just hoping that this will be a part of the educating the majority through so many means that we have to slow down a little bit to not do it tomorrow or before November 5th. And anyway, that we certainly appreciate the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and the staff for accepting this proposal for us to go forward with the information of educating the value of us as the descendants of the enslaved, telling and keeping alive our history. That's it. Hallelujah.
All right, she has a question.
I think that as we look at your data and we have a better understanding of the complexity of the enslaved process, families, and all that, as a part of the fellowship that we have created, we are actually moving in line with a quote that I saw in, I think, Lives Bound Together, Edmund Parker in 1898. This is the quote I saw. As they faced lives in bondage, Mount Vernon's enslaved people showed strength and resilience. And the definition of resilience is, in the face of trauma, tragedy, threats, or other significant sources of stress, there is adaptation.
Right.
So we will look at that information, even just looking at the complexity of breaking those families apart and all of the things that happen. We look at that and we apply the lens of resilience. How in the world did you make it? And we have chosen to focus on identifying not only the bad parts of enslavement, obviously, it's well documented, But we need more attention to resilience. What are the strengths? How did you live through that? How did your family survive? How did you build things around here in Mount Vernon when you take the tour? And you know that most of that work was done by the enslaved. We look at that with the lens of how, how, how did you demonstrate that resilience?
Well, I think that we're going to get some of that from the data, like looking at those families that were broken up, like um, the people who went forward after they lost their family. We also know from the work that the Tudor House has done in an instance where Mr. Peter separated a family, there was someone who went totally insane at the loss of his family. And one of the things that Crimea and the Tudor House people have been talking about is generational trauma because of these separations. So I think resilience and trauma are basically two sides to the same coin. So it's both showing how people persevered in the face of these challenges, but also how they might have been affected by the tragedies that befell them. Yes, yes.
Dr. Burr, thank you. Thank you so very much. I'm sorry I wasn't here a little bit earlier as you began. I am curious, given what we know or what we believe we know about President Jefferson's legacy and the ancestral descendants, I'm wondering if there are models that were used in that research that you have or can have that can further embellish or make factual, even further factual, your work.
So one thing that Monticello has done is they have the Getting to Word project, where they have done a lot of tracking of what happened to the enslaved at Monticello who were sold off at the lawn. And they regularly have invite them back to events at Monticello. So that's an interesting process that's within that whole foundation network, where they are doing the tracking and inviting people back to Monticello to have to obtain a sense of what their ancestors experienced. Right now, from what I understand, I know Judge Quander is a member, is there's the League of Descendants of the Enslaved at Mount Vernon, and they are trying to do a lot of oral histories and other tracking. So hopefully when I'm done, I'm creating some of the family trees that you saw up here. I have an assistant in New Mexico, Cheryl, and she's helped me by starting to create these trees on Ancestry.com. So these trees are private now, but it's possible when we are finished that this will be another level of data that can be shared with the various groups that will help people track their ancestors.
Thank you. We created the League of the Descendants of the Mount Vernon Enslaved because as time has gone on, we have come in contact with people who have said, oh, my ancestors were enslaved by George Washington. And we felt it was necessary to bring these people in under a tent, an umbrella or something. Even if we are loosely structured, we're not too tightly structured, not as tightly structured as we'd like. But we are focusing on finding out who they were, because the first thing you have to do is find out who these people are and then give them the opportunity to show how and in what way they are connected. My cousin LaShawn Quanda Mosley is right here in the back. I don't know if anybody else is here of our group. But the goal is to find out, first of all, who we are, because by finding out who we are, we can begin to share, compare, and contrast. And your coming to this opportunity at the right moment gives us a chance to try to supplement you to help you make your work easier, because you may never have found some of these people who have stories to tell that they know, and they're out in Kansas somewhere, that you would never have known about, and we would not have known about unless some of them came forward and identified themselves to us. So our mission, purpose, and goal is just in the face of struggle, to show resilience, and as Maya Angelou would say, and still I rise. So that's exactly the reason why the League has been created. Monticello has a parallel organization. Montpelier, James Madison has one. My understanding is Middleton in South Carolina has one, and Whitney in Louisiana, and some of the larger and even smaller, because we had the conference last year, March, I think, at the Museum of African American History and Culture, sponsored by the museum and also the National Trust for Historic Preservation, focusing on African American sites. And Joelle Gordon, who you referenced earlier, when she was there and I met her, she came up and we discovered that even though several of our family members were, of course, enslaved to George Washington and the Custis and Peter and Dandridge family, not Dandridge, we've discovered several of our ancestors who were sold south, not by the Washingtons and not by 272 Georgetown, but at the same time by other enslavers. And we are actively looking for those people. And they were predominantly sent off to Louisiana and Mississippi. We have 8 or 10 names, and now we're trying to see, Joelle's working with us to try to find those descendants' current relatives. Yeah.
Well stated, Judge, and we're going to let you have the last word. Oh, Sheila, Ms. Coates wants the last word. Okay, Ms.
5
Coates.
miles from here,
Okay.
Oakland Plantation. I'm a descendant, and we also are creating descendants of Oakland Plantation. Thank you.
All right.
And we're moving forward. Thank you.
All
George
right.
Washington
Thank you. Thank you.